Number 1.
This happened in early May of 2014, when my girlfriend and I decided to go on a camping trip in Wales. It was our first trip away together, and we drove the 2 hours from Cardiff to Newgale in my crappy old Renault. Newgale is a beautiful spot. There's not much there, just a really great beach, a campsite, pub, cafe, and a couple of surf places, all surrounded by rural countryside. The campsite is basically just a really big field across the road from the beach. It was early in the season, so there weren't many people in the campsite. Just a couple of groups on the far side of the field, and a group of German bikers, maybe about 10 of them, all with really small tents on the other side of the field. They didn't look like gang or outlaw bikers, but they did look pretty rough, and they were all pretty big guys. I got the impression they were looking over at us a bit when we arrived, but I didn't think much of it. We pitched our tent against the fence at the back of the field, as far as we could get from the other groups. The weather was great. We had a great day on the beach and spent the evening in the pub, getting drunk on Jaeger bombs. We returned to the tent when the pub closed, had a few more drinks, and closed the tent up to do what couples do. After a while, I heard some rustling noises right outside the tent. At first, I thought it must have been an animal or something blowing in the wind, so I just ignored it. The sound continued and got a bit louder. We stopped what we were doing, and I could tell my girlfriend was a bit freaked out by it. We both tried not to make any noise, so that we could try to identify the sound. All that we could hear was a rhythmic, repetitive rustling sound. At this point, it was fairly obvious that some creep was right outside the tent. I turned our lamp on and said, "Can you hear that?" very loudly to make it obvious that the creep was busted. The sound stopped, but we didn't hear any footsteps or flies being zipped up or anything like that. I was worried the creep was still there, so I got dressed and opened up the tent, knife and flashlight in hand. I did all this as loudly as possible to make it obvious the jig was up. I didn't really want a confrontation with an unknown pervert in the middle of the night, and thought this peeping Tom would rather have the chance to run away than get caught being a weirdo. Luckily, I was actually right. There was no sign of the creep when I searched around the tent. He must have been an expert stalker, as neither of us heard any footsteps or anything like that running away. While searching around, I did get the feeling that I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone. The place was silent and dark. We both were a little freaked out by this, so that kind of ruined the mood. I stayed up for a while and had a few more beers, keeping guard, so to speak. I didn't really feel like sleeping with some weirdo on the loose. The morning arrived without incident. The next day, we could see the German bikers beginning to pack up. We had to walk past them to get to the toilet block of the campsite. As we walked past, I could see one of them drop what he was doing and just stare at us, tracking us across the field with this horrible grin on his face. Honestly, I've never seen a creepier stare. You could tell that he did not care if we noticed. In fact, it seemed like he was trying to make it obvious that he was pleased to see us. I didn't say anything to my girlfriend, as I thought it would freak her out. I just knew it was him that had been pleasing himself outside of our tent the night before. As soon as we got out of earshot, my girlfriend said, "Did you see that guy looking at us? That was definitely the guy from last night." I didn't do or say anything to the bikers, as I didn't have proof that it was him, and even if I did, I didn't fancy my chances against a group of tough-looking guys dressed in leather. We did stick around before heading to the beach until the bikers finished packing up and drove away, just to make sure they were leaving, as we were staying at the site a few more days. The rest of the trip went off without a hitch. I guess the moral of the story is, move campsites if a bunch of creepy German dudes show up. These days I've got a camper van, so I feel much safer in that.
Number 2.
In 1994, when I was 23, I decided to go on a week-long camping trip alone to get my thoughts together. I had just graduated college here in California, and I needed to make some decisions about my future. I decided to go on a camping trip in Los Padres National Forest, as I had been there before as a kid, and it was quite peaceful. I packed my things, and drove to the park, and bought the week-long camping pass I needed. I told my parents where I was going, and they weren't too excited about me going alone, but as I was a male and well built, they only asked that I pack a knife for protection. I obliged. I parked my car and set forth down the trail that I had chosen. My plan was to hike to a small pond that was about 12 miles down the trail and spend my week there fishing, relaxing, and thinking about what I should do with the rest of my life. I hiked from morning to about 6 p.m., and I took my time taking pictures, eating my lunch, and even writing in my journal. At about 6 p.m., I finally reached the pond, and I unpacked my tent and equipment and got ready to sleep. I was so tired that I passed out and did not wake up until the morning. In the morning, I made some coffee, made myself a sandwich, and threw my fishing line into the pond. Over a couple of hours, I caught a few bluegill and was getting some much-needed solitude. I gutted my fish and put them back in the water so that they would stay cool for a couple of hours so that I can make them for lunch. After this, I went back in my tent and decided to take a nap. I fell asleep pretty quickly. About 30 minutes into my nap, I was awoken by a woman crying hysterically from what seemed to be a few hundred meters away. I instinctively got up quick, opened my tent, and turned toward where I was hearing the crying. What I saw scared me instantly. I saw a naked woman about 70 meters away, and what I would guess was her 40s, walking in my direction. She had long brown hair that was tangled, and her face was contorted in a way that made her cries that much more frightening. This woman was filthy all over, and she was bleeding from what I can only describe as her vaginal region. My first reaction was shock, but after a few seconds I cleared my head and I ran into my tent to grab my knife. I then walked over to the lady who was still crying hysterically and asked her what happened. As I got close to her, she reached out to me as if to give me an embrace. I hesitantly gave her one of my hands to hold on to and then walked her over to my tent. She just kept crying and leaning herself on me. When we got to my tent, I handed her some paper towels and some extra clothes and asked her again what happened and if I could help her clean up or in any other way I could. She ignored the towels and clothes and just let them fall on the floor. She then asked in a smoky, exhausted voice if she could lay down in my bed. I thought she might have been a rape victim, and I told her yes, definitely. She lied down on top of my sleeping bag and just kept crying and shaking. I decided to just let her be for a while and started packing up my stuff as I figured I would have to run back and get help for this woman. After about 25 minutes, I collected all of my belongings and walked back over to the tent to see the woman had calmed down. I unzipped the tent and looked inside. The woman was just lying there, no longer crying, but just staring at nothing. I again asked her what happened, but still she didn't answer. I then started to tell her that I was going to run and get help, and that she could come with me or just stay there until help arrived. Again she said nothing. I then told her that I was going to run to the ranger station and that I would be back as soon as possible. I left her some water and some food and started walking back towards the trail. As I got to the trail, I heard a man's voice yelling from across the pond from our point. I turned to where I heard the yelling, and I saw a man about 200 meters away, also naked with a long beard and lots of hair. I could not understand what he was saying at first, but as he got closer, I could understand the words.
I'm no good. I'm no good.
In a low, almost unintelligible groan. I was so freaked out at this point that I was frozen in fear. I was thinking about my options when I noticed the woman getting out of my tent and started walking towards the man. He then began running towards her, and she towards him. When they reached each other, they then embraced. At this point, I was in total confusion and shock about what was happening. I just stood there and watched whatever the fuck this was happen. After it seemed about 30 minutes, they let go of each other, and I could see them talking. The woman then points towards me, and then towards her stomach. They both talk for a little while longer, and then both of them start walking towards me. I again just stood there trying to figure out what the hell was going on. As they got within 50 meters of me, both the man and the woman yelled at me almost simultaneously. "Can you help us?" I was still confused, so I yelled back at them. "Help you with what?" And, "What happened?" The man and woman did not reply, but only put their arms in a baby swaddling position. I yelled back at them, "What baby?" in a concerned voice. The man then said,
I'm no good. We need you for a baby.
I then said, "I don't understand," and then started to take a few steps back. At this point, the woman grabbed 2 large rocks from the ground and handed one to the man. They began to run towards me. I was terrified. I dropped my backpack on the ground and started sprinting as fast as I could down the trail. I could hear them screaming at me, "We need your help with baby," over and over again. And I could hear them scrambling down the trail behind me. They had no shoes on, and the trail was mostly rock, so I knew if I kept running, they couldn't keep up for very long. After about 15 minutes, I slowly hear their cries die down, to the point where I could no longer hear them at all. It took me 6 hours to get back to the ranger station with me running, and then taking a break when I needed to. When I got to the ranger station, I threw open the door and began explaining what just happened to the ranger. He knew I was serious from the emotion I conveyed, and told me that he was going to get some backup out there to check out the situation and to retrieve my belongings for me. He advised me to just sit tight in the ranger station and that they would be riding their ATVs out there within the hour. I told him that I would rather just go home and that if he could just call me after they investigated, as I lived 2 hours away. He said okay. I drove home and told my family what happened and waited. I ended up falling asleep on my parents' bed like a child and slept through the whole night. The next morning, my father woke me up and told me that he had just gotten off the phone with the Rangers and that they had just taken a naked man and woman into custody. They told my father that the 2 people would not identify themselves and that they found them walking on the trail, heading back towards the pond. Both the man and the woman were committed to a psychiatric hospital, where it was discovered they both had schizophrenia. Nothing else was known about them. They couldn't figure out who they were or how they had gotten to that location. That's all they could tell us. As far as all my equipment goes, I told them that I didn't want it anymore, as much of it I'm sure was caked in blood, and who knows what else. We found out a few months later that the couple had set up a campsite hidden near the edge of the pond, and that the Rangers had found a grave there of a very small fetus. The man and woman were identified as a married couple who had gone off their medication and decided to move out to the woods to live away from society. From what everyone had guessed, they tried to start a family out there, but due to the malnourishment, the woman had a miscarriage. I guess the man had blamed himself for being no good and wanted me to take his place in impregnating his wife. This is by far the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me, and I have never gone camping since that day. This has forever changed me as a person and has made me weary of strangers. I hope no one has to experience what I did that day.
There's always a reason to be afraid.